Martin Luther King was born in Atlanta, Georgia, on the 15th of January 1929. It was a very troubled time in that part of America, especially for people who were black. King was a very bright, intelligent man. He was a Christian who dedicated his life to the church. He was so clever, he was able to skip a couple of year groups during his education. All he wanted to do was to become a minister in the church and look after the people who were members of his church. The southern states of the United States had a very negative and poor attitude towards black people. Some of them at that time felt that black people were less important than white people, an attitude that today we would correctly consider to be disgraceful. Yet it wasn't so long ago. The groups of hateful white people were called white supremacists. Racial hatred is where people whose skin is one colour, often white, treat people with different coloured skin as lesser people, less important, less human. This was the attitude of some people during the 1950s and 1960s in the southern states of America. They openly hated the black people, including supposedly important civil leaders who should have known better, people such as mayors and people in charge of the police force, for example. During this time, there were numerous examples of black people being badly treated by white people, including really nasty violence and even killings, just because of the colour of their skin. Not all white people were like this, but sadly, a significant number of them in the southern states were. In some states, such as Georgia, there were large rule books written, the law, which would set out how black people would live their lives separately from white people. Black people were not allowed to marry white people. They weren't allowed to sit in the same seats on buses and even had to get on the buses from special, different doors at the back. They were allocated separate seats there at the back. They would have to use different toilets, drink from water fountains that were in different places, use different entrances to public buildings, such as cinemas, and even sit in different sections away from white people. Black people would be forced to eat in different places from white people. It was much harder for black people to get jobs, and often those that were available were much more poorly paid. They had to live in different houses, often much poorer quality, and were not usually given permission to vote in elections. This meant they wouldn't be able to elect leaders who could look after their rights. In the city of Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, black people, just as elsewhere, were forced to be segregated on the public buses. They had to give up their seats to white people if the bus was full, even though black people made up about 3/4 of the total number of passengers who used the service. Black people would also experience beatings from some of the white bus drivers and would sometimes be prevented from actually entering the buses, even though they had paid their bus fare. On the 1st of December 1955, Rosa Parks, a black American lady, was seated on the front row of the seats that were given to the black people. She came to realise that she was being driven by a white man called James Blake. On a previous occasion, Blake had prevented her from entering the bus at the front door where she tried to get on. He had told her to enter at the back. Reluctantly, she had gone to the back door, but before she was able to get on, Blake had driven off and left her on her own, stranded without transport. A white person entered the bus at the front door, and the driver told everyone in the black section to move back so that the white person could sit at the front of the black seats. Rosa Parks refused to move, though the other black passengers did move. She was actually arrested and was later fined $14 in total, which was a lot of money at that time. The story of her refusal to move and fine that she received got out among the black people of Montgomery. They were furious about it. They could see it was unjust and unfair. They decided to organise a protest against this awful situation. About this time, Martin Luther King was a pastor, a kind of priest or vicar, if you like, who really just wanted to complete his studies and help the people of his parish, his church. He didn't want to get involved in action, but when he was asked if he would, he said that the community could use his church for their meeting. To his amazement, about 5,000 people turned up and packed themselves into the church. They discussed what had happened to Rosa Parks and also about the segregation that they all experienced. They managed to persuade Martin Luther King to help them and lead their protest against the injustices they were all experiencing. Although King was reluctantly persuaded to take on this role, he was determined to make sure that whatever protest went ahead, it would be strictly non-violent. He was passionately against violence, which he saw as being terribly destructive and cruel. King met with a group to organise what they should do. They agreed that they would establish a protest whereby black people would refuse to board the buses. This would create a lot of hardship for the black people since they relied heavily on the buses to travel to work, etc. However, as far as they could, they persuaded other people to help. Taxi drivers, for example, were persuaded often to allow the black community to travel in their taxis for the same money as they would have spent on the buses. The city of Montgomery was stunned by the protest. It cost them a huge amount of money since they had a large bus service that needed to be paid for, and black people made up about 3/4 of the paying customers who would normally use it. The lack of payments put the city under huge pressure. They lost so much money during this time, they couldn't cope with it. After just over a year, the city gave way and agreed to end segregation on their buses. The protest had succeeded, and black people no longer had to sit in separate seats from white people. The black people of the southern states of America were convinced that the government weren't doing sufficient to help them. They felt they were ignoring the terrible things they could see happening, turning what's called a blind eye to the situation. On August the 28th, 1963, one of the biggest marches for human rights ever seen in America took place. Martin Luther King delivered a speech to the huge crowd that was gathered in Washington, the capital city. He talked about the unfairness that black people experienced. He went on to give one of the most famous speeches of all time, a speech known as "I Have a Dream."
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Martin Luther King continued to fight for improvements for the rights of black Americans from 1966 through 1968. During that time, he was still hated by the white supremacists. Through the non-violent demonstration that he had arranged and led, the rights and lives of black Americans, especially in the southern states of America, improved dramatically. At long last, laws were being passed to help the black Americans. Segregation was ended, and even more importantly, people's attitudes towards the black Americans were improved. King seemed to know, however, that his work had raised many enemies. He sensed that he didn't have too long left to live. He talked about this in one of his speeches. He was asked about some of the threats he'd received from white supremacists. He said, "Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead." He said, "I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land, but I might not get there with you." On April the 4th, in Memphis, Tennessee, at his motel, the Lorraine Motel, he stood on the balcony of the second floor by his room. Just after 6 p.m, he was fatally shot. A man called James Earl Ray was later arrested and convicted of his murder. Martin Luther King, activist and civil rights leader, was dead. Today in America, attitudes are far from perfect, and there is still some way to go to reach a time when there is no more racism. However, things are very much better. The laws which were passed allowed for black people of America to have equal rights to white people, and many black people flourished. Martin Luther King made a huge difference to justice and fairness in the United States. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom and also the Congressional Gold Medal. These are the highest honours that can be awarded to any civilian in America. Such is the regard for what King did. Every year, he is remembered and honoured with a national holiday, Martin Luther King Day, which is on the third Monday of every January. He is now considered a national hero. The changes he helped make against racism and injustice are amongst the most remarkable of any person in history.